Grab your drawing tools and draw with me. I'll be talking through my tips on how I colour things in at the moment. My name is Von and I'm an artist. So when I colour in drawings, I think about three things. The first thing is the colour palette. So having a basic understanding of colour theory is super useful when pulling together an overall colour palette. For me, my process right now is, firstly, I decide on a dominant colour, and then I use its analogous colours, so the colours on either side of it on a colour wheel, in order to create the base of my palette. Recently, I've been attracted to using a lot of reds, purples and blues, and those three are analogous colours. I keep in mind what their complementary colours are and intentionally save them to create either highlights or shadows. I'll touch more on using complementary colours in my third point. At this point in time, I don't really fuss around with trying to build up a specific or a particular fancy palette at the moment. Things like triadic or like split complementary, like those are just words to me, and I'm trying to keep things simple at this stage about how I want to improve my use of colour. But starting out with a plan of a colour palette, using analogous and then complementary colours can help you narrow down your focus instead of using every single colour under the sun. Not to say that's a bad thing, like go for it, but I'm just not there yet. The second thing I think about is colour values. So the value of a colour is the relative lightness or darkness of a colour. So how grey is the actual colour? In terms of application more broadly, I look at the highlights, the midtones and the shadows of the reference image I'm using. I start from an outline and then specifically circle out and separate the highlights. I've typically worked from what's lightest and then layer colours on to create darker parts and then the shadows. But that being said, I'm trying to experiment with a new way of colouring, where I've recently been working from midtones to shadows and then to the light parts. I think this alternative approach is a little bit more like how digital artists or many like acrylic or oil painters might work. It's been a bit of a mindset shift because it's much trickier to make something lighter than darker when working with colour pencils and watercolour, which are mediums that I'm much more comfortable with. In terms of trying to determine colour values, a trick that I like to use is to put your drawing into grayscale, or like to blur your vision a little bit. Doing this can help with seeing if there's not enough contrast and can highlight areas that might need more highlight and or more shadow. So during the early stages of a drawing, I try and focus more on like what the value of the colour is versus the actual hue of the colour. As the drawing progresses, I like to think about my third thing, which is considering the colour proportions within a drawing. So what I mean by a colour proportion is how much one colour or a set of colours makes up the drawing. It's like the relative quantity of a given hue or value within a drawing. I feel like this last factor is kind of like a culmination of the previous two tips. So like at the 60-70% mark of like feeling a drawing's complete, I try to take a step back and reassess if my drawing has areas that could either be made darker or have highlights. Complementary colours really come into play here, as I like to reserve them specifically for highlights and to build shadows. For example, when I use a palette of mostly red, purple and blue, I know that their complementary colours are green, yellow and orange respectively. Using complementary colours really helps to create depth and contrast within a drawing. As I mentioned, I use the complementary colours either as a highlight accent as they are visually contrasting, and or I'll use them to create depth by gently layering the complementary colours instead of using black as a shadow colour. Proportion remains important, especially for accent colours. Like, it might sound obvious, but those accent colours lose their impact the more you use them. So those are the three things that I specifically consider when it comes to colouring in my drawings. Firstly, thinking about your overall palette up front. Secondly, knowing how you're using the colours values. And thirdly, keeping the overall proportions of the colours in check so that your shadows have depth and your highlights pop. I'd love to know any tips or tricks that you have when you draw or render your art. On the way to recovery, so stay tuned for the next video, which will definitely be on time. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!